Drum roll, please. We are finally ready to project the stats now that our tool is all set up and built with the various building blocks we've worked on until now. It has been a long journey here, but for those of you that stuck with me, I am proud of you and your hard work is going to pay off shortly. Now that we have our function, we are ready to run a for loop that will loop over our list of player IDs and project the season stats for each player using our player comparison function we just created. Our goal is to get the projections for every player, then we can measure the effectiveness of our model and go back to tune it as necessary. Before looping over every player, let's create a smaller list of 10 players and write a for loop. Here is a randomly selected list of 10 really good players. Player IDs, I can assure you LeBron James is in there somewhere. Let's use their 2017-18 season to predict their 2018-19 season, since that is already completed so we can check how our model performed. We are going to put our projections into an empty list, which we can later convert into a data frame. Let's create final projections as an empty list. Let's run these. Then let's also refresh our data frame by reading in the CSV to make sure we have the most up-to-date cell. So here, this is taking our per game data. Let's run that. And we are going to drop the 2018-19 season data so we don't use those in the projections, since we will measure against it later. We can select all rows that are not 2018-19 for season ID and save it in a data frame. To do this, we are basically selecting all of the season IDs that are not 2018-19, and let's save this into a df new data frame. And just to confirm, let's get a sample. And we don't see any 18-19. We can run it one more time. No 18-19. Let's also run through normalizing the data again after cleaning the data framed. From here, we can say df cleaned equals df new drop na, how equals any. And then remember our minimum games played is 10. So we want to filter our df cleaned data frame on games played greater than the min GP. And then we have to take our filtered data frame, group by the season ID, and we want to apply our vort function, and we'll save this to df final. And then let's just get our tail to make sure everything looks okay. Everything's normalized, season IDs 2017-18. And let's read in our season list again. And for good measure, let's save back in. Let's rerun some of our functions. And remember, our player comparison function takes 3 inputs: the data frame, the season ID, and the player ID. We currently have all of our player IDs in a list with the 10 players we're sampling on, so we can loop over it and run our function. We will append our projections to our empty lists. So here we can say for baller in 10 players, which is our list. Our current player ID equals our baller ID. Our current player season equals 2017-18. And then we're going to say our player comparison tool. And what we want to take is the df final that we just created, our current player season, and our current player ID. And then since this returns our projected stats, let's save this to projections. And then let's also add in an if projections equals none, continue. And again, our final projections is where we want to append our projections. So now if we run this, we're going to loop over our 10 players list, which has our player IDs in it. We're going to set the the baller ID equal to the current player ID. We know our current player season is a constant. Then we're going to run through our function, which has taken our normalized and filtered DF final, our current player season, and our current player ID, saving it to projections. Now, if the projections equal none, we'll continue. And then finally, we're going to append our projections to our final projections dictionary. So let's run this. And that's our print statement to give us an update on what's happening. So far, everything looks so good. And we'll wait for this to finish. And we can start working on another cell, but until it's done, we actually can't run this. Cool. Now let's take our final projections and print it. And you'll see we have all of our projected data for our 10 player IDs. Now let's convert it into a data frame and merge it with our player names so we can see what these look like. We can turn it into a data frame by just passing it as a single parameter to our pd.dataframe method. It's a list of dictionaries, so it will read in nicely. So here we can say pd data frame final projections, and let's just save this to our test projections. And let's get a sample of our test projections. Nice. And again, we want to get the player name from a CSV to merge it with our player ID so we can have more fun eyeballing it. So let's create a new data frame names that reads in our player ID player name info. And finally, we can merge our test projections with df names left on player ID, right on player ID, and how it's going to be an inner. And we'll save this to as our final stat df. And then we can print our final stat df, but let's round it to 1. And there we have it. James Harden, Lillard, DeRozan, Rubio, Bledsoe, Covington, Gobert, Love, Paul George, and Klay Thompson with all of their projections for the 2018-19 season. Now, you're ready to run a for loop for all of the players to get their projections. I recommend only running it for the top 150 players, since in a 10-man league with 15 roster spots, you will only draft 150 players. To run it for everyone, you can read in the 2017-18 player ID CSV and convert it to a list to loop over. So for example, if we just took this, and we're not going to run it, but I can show you how to do it. Let's just take all of our player info data, save it to player df, and then what we're going to do is this player df, we are going to filter the season ID to where it equals 2017-18. And let's save this as a player filter in case we want to try it for another season. And then we can run 2018 player IDs. And I forgot you can't start with a number in a data frame. Player IDs 2018 equals player filter. And again, we only want the player ID column, which we're going to save to list. And if we look at this, this should be all of our 2018 player IDs in a nice list that we can for loop over. So here, what we would do is we would just say, if we go grab our previous for loop, let's copy this. And instead of our 10 players, we would write in player IDs 2018. And you would run that. And I'm going to run this offline so we don't have to wait for it to run all 150 players. But what we're also going to do is just add one more thing here to help with the measurement down the road. So our player info columns are going to be player name, player ID, and projected season ID. Now we're going to use these later to compare, but basically in the final projections, I'm only going to want the player info columns to save into a player info data frame. And then what we're going to do is we're going to save the final projections to CSV, and we're going to save the player info to CSV so I can access these later when measuring. Now I'm not going to run these, but I'm just setting this up so you can follow along at home in case you need to run it yourself. And again, this would be the final projections. Actually, after we filter it all, it's a final stat df is going to be what we're actually after. And that will be the player info, but that will be final stat df. Cool. Let's see how our model performed.